The night shift at Sacred Heart started the same way every time, and Natalie Hayes arrived 37 minutes early, punched in at 19:23, and walked directly to the trauma unit without stopping at the break room. 3 years of this. 3 years of arriving before the sun finished dying over San Diego. 3 years of volunteering for the patients everyone else rotated away from, the ones whose monitors beeped irregular rhythms and whose families had already made their peace. She moved through the corridors like someone who'd learned to be invisible, her scrubs a pale blue that didn't catch light, her shoes silent on cold linoleum that smelled of industrial bleach mixed with something metallic underneath, the smell of blood that never quite washed away, no matter how the housekeeping staff scrubbed. Her locker was in the corner of the changing room, away from the social clusters where day shift nurses gossiped about their lives. She hung her jacket carefully on the hook, the old navy canvas with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, frayed edges catching fluorescent light for exactly 2 seconds before the fabric folded away from sight. That patch had traveled further than she ever would again. It carried weight that had nothing to do with ounces. She touched it once, the habitual gesture of someone checking a parachute, then moved into the hospital proper. The night unit had for critical patients. She reviewed the charts first, always first, reading the vital signs and medication schedules with the focused intensity of someone whose previous job had required parsing human physiology the way most people read weather reports. Room 341, septic pneumonia, stable on current antibiotics. Room 343, post-op coronary bypass, weaning off sedation. Room 345, acute liver failure, family meeting scheduled for morning. And room 347, the new admission that had arrived while day shift was still punching out, rolling through the ambulance bay on a stretcher that moved like it carried something classified. The chart for room 347 simply read, male, age 71, admitted via law enforcement, multiple gunshot wounds, chest tubes in place, no next of kin listed, no visitors authorized. The orders were sparse, handwritten in Sterling's impatient scrawl, monitor vitals, maintain sedation, notify attending immediately if change in status. Someone had written in the margin, do not discuss with patient or family. Natalie pushed the door open quietly. The Admiral, though nothing in his chart confirmed he was anything but a John Doe with holes in his chest, lay perfectly still under 2 blankets, his skin the color of a 2-day-old bruise. His left side was wrapped in heavy bandaging, chest tubes exiting his body like transparent life support, draining dark fluid that pooled at the base of the collection bottles. 2 entry wounds on his anterior chest, spaced tight and professional. 1 puncture high on the left shoulder. 2 more on his right flank, the trajectory angle suggesting he'd been turning when they hit him. Combat spacing. Combat precision. The kind of wounds you only got when people who knew exactly how to shoot were trying very hard to make sure you didn't stand up again. She checked his pulse without speaking, her fingers finding the radial artery at his wrist. Her hands had stopped shaking 3 years ago, but they remembered how to shake. The tremor lived in the muscle memory beneath her skin, in the synaptic pathways that had learned to move under fire. Now, in the fluorescent quiet of room 347, her fingers were steady. She counted 84 beats per minute. Pressure good. Skin warm. He was sedated deeply enough that he shouldn't have been conscious, but she felt the slight tension in his wrist, the micro-adjustment of someone whose body was aware of threat even when his mind had checked out. She smoothed the blanket, a gesture that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the small dignities that separated hospital care from processing, and left without speaking. The hallway outside was empty except for the hum of ventilators in adjacent rooms, a sound like the world breathing through a machine. Natalie moved to the medication cart and verified the 4 orders: 2 milligrams midazolam for sedation, 1 milligram morphine on demand, prophylactic antibiotics running on continuous drip. Everything proper. Everything by the book. She was preparing the evening doses when the smell changed, sharp aftershave preceding Dr. Sterling by 3 seconds, announcing him like a herald announcing a king. Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 6 o'clock, though the shift didn't officially start until 7 o'clock. He liked arriving early to check on the overnight changes, to make sure night shift hadn't destroyed anything he'd ordered. His white coat was pristine, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a symbol of office, his jaw cut at angles that made him look like someone had designed him to be photographed. He was the kind of handsome that required maintenance, expensive haircuts, a gym membership that showed, the kind of watch that told you his family had made money the way families like his always did, early, quietly, and in quantities that ensured future handsome sons would arrive perfect from the womb. He moved through the unit with the stride of someone who'd never questioned his right to occupy space, and when he glanced at Natalie preparing medications, his eyes did something that took no time at all. They registered her competence, assessed it as a potential problem, and immediately looked away with the kind of dismissal that was more insulting than any words. She didn't look up. Looking up would have required acknowledging his presence with her face, and she'd learned, over 3 years, that the smallest adjustment of her expression was interpreted as a challenge. So she kept her focus on the medication vials, her fingers moving through the routine with the precision that came from having done this same task in darkness, with incoming fire, with hands that belonged to someone younger and someone trying not to die. Sterling made his rounds with a resident trailing behind him, a nervous medical student named Chen who flinched whenever Sterling changed his tone. In room 341, Sterling reviewed the sepsis case file, nodded once at Natalie's notes on the septic process, and continued without comment. In room 343, he examined the post-op patient's sternotomy incision, changed the dressing with rough efficiency, and moved on. He was running on the schedule only he could see, executing the rounds only he understood as performance art. But it was room 347 that made him pause. He stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds, an eternity in hospital time, looking at the Admiral's sleeping face, at the chest tubes, at the expensive precision of a body that had been shot by people who knew their job. Something flickered across Sterling's face, not compassion, not even curiosity, but something close to recognition. The kind of look a man gives another man who's traveled to places Sterling had only read about in books his father had left on study shelves. Then he turned, and his eyes met Natalie's. What happened next didn't take long. It never did. "Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who'd never been interrupted. "Has the patient been conscious at all? Said anything?" "No, sir," Natalie replied. "Sedation is holding. Vital stable. No complications since admission." Sterling nodded, and something in his expression shifted. It was the look of someone who'd just solved a problem he didn't know he had. "Good. Keep it that way. The patient is classified. No conversations. No information sharing. Is that clear?" "Clear," Natalie confirmed, her voice the texture of hospital linoleum. "Excellent." Sterling's smile appeared like a spotlight suddenly switched on. "I was wondering if perhaps night shift might lack the discretion required for this particular case. But I can see I was mistaken." It was the kind of compliment that wasn't, delivered in the kind of tone that made compliment sound like diagnosis. Sterling turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, already dictating notes to Chen, already moving on to the next thing, already forgetting that Natalie existed. But Natalie stood still in room 347's doorway for another moment, a hand resting on the cardiac monitor's edge. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, a rhythm slightly faster than normal. Her job, her real job, the one the Navy had given her 18 years ago and the one she'd never actually stopped performing, was to notice things. To track vital signs. To understand threat assessment. To read rooms the way other people read books. She'd just watched Dr. Sterling look at the Admiral and make a calculation. She'd just watched him revise his assessment of her based on her confirmation that she would keep secrets. And she'd just watched him decide that she was someone he could use. She'd seen that look before. On officers whose careers depended on their next assignment. On men whose loyalty was for sale if the price was right. On people who'd learned that power was a game where the rules changed depending on who was keeping score. What they didn't know was that she'd spent 3 years learning how to lose. At 1:56, the Admiral's monitor alarm went off, a sharp electronic screech that meant the patient's oxygen saturation had dropped to 63%. Alarms in hospitals were supposed to be rare, serious events. This alarm sounded like a crisis arriving exactly on schedule. Natalie was already moving before her conscious mind caught up. She'd been charting at the station, which meant she was 17 seconds away from his room. She covered the distance in 12, pushing through the door just as the Admiral's body went rigid, his back arching as his lungs tried to pull oxygen from air that wasn't getting to them. "Call Sterling," Natalie said to the night tech, her voice a flat command. "Tell him room 347 is decompensating." She didn't wait for a response. She was already moving to the bedside, already assessing. The right lung wasn't inflating, the chest tubes weren't draining, the patient's abdomen was rigid and distended. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of collapse that happened when a lung ruptured and the air had nowhere to go but into the chest cavity, collapsing the heart and lungs under pressure that built with every breath he tried to take. He had minutes. Maybe less. The needle decompression kit was in the supply cabinet. She knew exactly where because she'd organized it 3 days ago after the evening shift had left it in the wrong place. She pulled it open, found the 14-gauge needle, and moved back to the bed without hesitation. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. That was the spot. That was the place where the pressure would release and let him breathe again. She swabbed the skin with antiseptic, and her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from Sanjin, from the combat medical course that had trained her to do this while incoming fire snapped overhead, that had taught her to find this exact spot on living human beings when the only other option was watching them die. The needle went in at the correct angle, and she felt the change immediately, the hiss of air escaping from his chest cavity, the sudden decompression, his body relaxing as his lungs could expand again. The monitor showed it immediately. Oxygen saturation climbing, 68. 71. 78. 84. His heart rate dropping from the tachycardia of suffocation back into a rhythm that suggested a human body instead of a machine in failure. She stood back from the bed, still holding the needle case, her breathing exactly normal because she'd learned that her breathing was information too, data that could be read by people watching her. The Admiral's eyes opened slowly, not because the sedation had worn off, but because his body had recognized that it was no longer dying. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, his eyes moving from her face to her hands, to the needle she'd just used to save his life. "You served," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I know that technique." She didn't answer. She simply began charting the event, her pen moving with steady purpose across the medical record, documenting the crisis and the intervention with the clinical precision that meant this event would be measured, analyzed, and filed away in the permanent record of his stay at Sacred Heart. Behind her, the Admiral's monitors beeped in a steady, normal rhythm. By the time Dr. Sterling arrived, 4 minutes later, his hair slightly mussed from sleep, the crisis was over. The patient was stable. The oxygen saturation was 91%. The tension pneumothorax was resolved, and Natalie was standing at the nurse's station preparing a new medication schedule as though she hadn't just performed an emergency intervention that probably required, or wouldn't have, depending on how Sterling wanted the paperwork filed, his authorization. "What happened?" Sterling demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Tension pneumothorax," Natalie said simply. "Presented at 1:13. Decompressed at 1:49. Did you call me?" Tech called. Line was busy. It was the kind of lie that was technically true. The line might have been busy. The fact that she hadn't waited, that she'd acted on her own authority based on the kind of training that never expired and never needed a civilian approval signature, was the part of the story that didn't need to be said. Sterling's jaw tightened. She could see him calculating, the way the Admiral had almost died on his watch, the way Natalie had prevented that death, the way her intervention had saved his reputation, but also, in some calculus that was uniquely Sterling's, stolen his authority over this case. He was the kind of man who couldn't tolerate people being useful unless he'd given them permission to be. "Hayes," he said, his voice cold in a way that suggested he'd made a decision about her. "I'm going to need you to document exactly what you did. Every step. I want it in writing, filed with administration, and I want it done today." She nodded once. "Of course, Doctor." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she saw something in his expression shift. The look of someone who'd just identified a problem he was going to take great pleasure in solving. The look of someone who'd made an enemy out of the girl who'd had the audacity to be better at his job than he was. The dressing change began at 0815. Room 347. The Admiral's daughter stood in the corner with two grandchildren ages 7 and 9, their small faces serious as the nurses worked. Natalie's gloved hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, gentle irrigation of the chest wound, saline at body temperature, each movement economical and clean. The antiseptic smell hung thick in the air, mixed with something else, the smell of institutional failure, though she couldn't have named it then. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway like a cloud crossing the sun. "Nurse Hayes," he announced, his voice pitched high enough for the entire family to hear. "I'm genuinely curious about your educational background. Did your community college program cover complex battlefield trauma, or are you mostly improvising at this point?" His smile was a weapon. Natalie continued working, one measured breath through her nose, her hands never hesitating. The Admiral's daughter's face flushed red. One of the grandchildren tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why is the doctor being mean?" "I'm following the protocol you signed off on, Doctor." Natalie's voice came out steady, flat as a runway. The words were correct, deferential even, but something underneath them, some bedrock of certainty, made them land like a challenge. Sterling stepped closer, his shadow falling across the wound. Protocol requires clinical judgment, not just mechanical compliance. It requires the kind of training that comes from actual medical school, not, what do they call enlisted personnel? Orders followers. He glanced at the Admiral's daughter, inviting her into the joke. She didn't smile. Some people are simply born to assist, not to lead. Natalie's jaw tightened. A single tear escaped from her left eye, not a tremor, not a breakdown, just one tear sliding down her cheek as she continued working, her hand steady as surgical lasers, never breaking rhythm, never breaking eye contact with the wound that needed her. She wiped it away with her shoulder without pausing, without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. "I've seen what real leadership looks like, Dr. Sterling, and this isn't it." The room went dead silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. One of the grandchildren whispered, "Grandma, what does that mean?" Sterling's face flushed purple. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out without another word, his posture rigid as a man who'd just been publicly unmade by a person he considered beneath him. The Admiral's daughter met Natalie's eyes. Something passed between them, recognition, maybe. Apology, maybe. The Admiral himself, despite the pain and medication, managed a slight nod. Natalie finished the dressing change in silence. But that wasn't the worst part. What Sterling lacked in immediate retaliation, he compensated for with patient institutional cruelty. 3 days later, Natalie sat in the break room with a turkey sandwich she'd made at 0500 that morning, before her daughter woke, before the day could tighten its grip. The sandwich tasted like dust. 2 nurses entered, saw her, exchanged glances, and left without pouring coffee. A resident came in next, filled his cup, saw her sitting there, and walked out without acknowledgement. Then another. Then another. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. It was choreographed. Sterling had made a call, had suggested in his casual way to the day shift lead that Natalie was difficult, unstable, that it was safer to keep distance. The message spread like contagion through the unit: when she arrives, you leave. Don't eat with her. Don't make eye contact. Don't be seen as her ally. She sat alone, chewing slowly, her hands folded on the table, her eyes fixed on the wall-mounted television playing muted news about a shooting downtown, about a politician's indictment, about a missing child. The room felt like a tomb she was being buried alive in. She left her sandwich half-eaten and returned to work without complaint. The write-up appeared on the unit board 48 hours later. Central location. Mandatory visibility. Medication delay, a Hayes, N, written in red marker by someone with a heavy hand, each letter pressing hard enough to tear the paper slightly. The citation claimed a pain medication was administered 32 minutes late on a patient in room 302. The patient's chart told a different story. The drug was given at 14:04, documented at 14:04, exactly as prescribed. But the write-up was official, bearing Sterling's signature, bearing the weight of his authority. Day shift gathered around it, reading, whispering. Night shift saw it when they arrived for the evening shift. The words seemed to grow larger every time Natalie walked past them. Hayes, N. Hayes, N. Hayes, N. She stood in front of the board for exactly 10 seconds, her jaw so tight it seemed carved from granite. Then she pulled it down, folded it once, and placed it in the pocket of her scrub jacket. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. Sterling watched from the physician's lounge window, phone already out, already dialing. He called the first board member, someone's former roommate from medical school with power over credentialing. Then the second. Then he contacted her nursing school directly, asked pointed questions about her references, her clinical rotations, whether there had ever been concerns about her judgment or her scope of practice. He scheduled an outside investigator to audit her patient records dating back 3 years, building a termination case with the methodical cruelty of someone who'd been humiliated and was determined to erase the humiliator. The machinery of institutional power began to turn. Natalie finished her shift at 0700 the next morning, her steps still measured, still precise, still refusing to acknowledge the weight of what was coming. She drove home in her 2006 Honda Civic with 147,000 miles on the odometer, her daughter still asleep in the apartment, the morning sun turning the city pink and gold. She made breakfast, eggs and toast, and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, reading the news on her phone. Nothing on the outside betrayed the fact that her career was being systematically dismantled, that the evidence was being gathered, that Sterling was making calls to people who made decisions about people like her. But the Admiral was awake in room 347, and his eyes followed the monitors, following the nurses, following the rhythm of the hospital. He'd heard what Sterling said. He'd seen how Natalie absorbed it. And he'd recognized something in her hands, in her posture, in the way she defended him that first night when his lung was collapsing and his oxygen saturation was plummeting toward zero. The crisis came at 0200 hours, for days after the humiliation campaign began. Natalie was restocking the trauma crash cart when the Admiral's monitor alarm screamed, not a gentle alert, but a full code alert, the sound that sent electricity through the entire unit. She was moving before her conscious mind registered what she'd heard, running toward room 347, muscle memory overriding protocol. VTAC. Oxygen saturation 62 and falling. His neck veins distended like rope, his trachea deviated left. Tension pneumothorax. His lungs were collapsing. The on-call resident, Dr. Chen, 3 months out of medical school, stood frozen at the bedside, his mouth slightly open. "I'll page Sterling," he said, reaching for the phone. "No time." Natalie moved past him, already prepping the site with the efficiency of someone who'd done this under enemy fire, who understood that 30 seconds of hesitation meant death. She positioned the Admiral supine, counted ribs with her fingers using the landmarks only someone with her training would instinctively know. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands moved like they were reading Braille, finding the exact location between the ribs where pressure was building, where air was accumulating in the space between the lung and chest wall, crushing his heart, suffocating him slowly. "You can't," Chen stammered. "That's beyond scope. You need physician orders." "That's a procedure." Natalie didn't answer. She prepped the site, found the 14-gauge angiocath needle in the crash cart, her movements economical and automatic. The Admiral's eyes opened, recognition flashing through the morphine haze, and he whispered hoarsely through the oxygen mask, "You served." "I know that technique." She didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The needle went in smooth and sure, finding the space between his ribs, and then came the sound that meant everything, the hiss of air escaping, pressure releasing, his chest expanding as his lungs could finally inflate. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Rhythm returning. Oxygen saturation climbing from 62 to 72 to 88 to 94. Sinus rhythm. The room went quiet. Chen stared, phone forgotten in his hand. The Admiral's breathing stabilized, his color improving by the second, his eyes fixed on Natalie's face like she was the only real thing in the room. The thoracic surgeon arrived 17 minutes later, placed a chest tube, reviewed what had happened, and nodded at Natalie with the kind of respect that comes from recognizing mastery when you see it. "Textbook decompression," the surgeon said. "Where'd you train?" "Just followed the protocols, doctor." Natalie's voice was deferential again, the mask back in place. But something had shifted. Something had cracked open. The Admiral watched her from his bed, his eyes asking questions that no official answer could satisfy. He'd recognized the precision. He'd recognized the training. He'd recognized someone who was far more than just a nurse. What happened next changed everything. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart always moved like a choreographed ballet, medications at 0600, vitals at 0630, assessments by 0700. But at 6:41, when the Admiral's daughter pressed the call button, the rhythm shifted. The nurse station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Natalie was paged to room 347. She grabbed her clipboard and moved without hurrying, a measured pace that gave nothing away, though her pulse had already quickened at the sound of his voice on the intercom. The Admiral's daughter sat in the vinyl chair beside his bed, her face sharp with the same military bearing as her father, the kind of composure you inherited or you didn't. "Senior Chief," the Admiral said quietly. Not nurse. Not her name. The words landed like a call sign only he could hear. Natalie's hand stilled for exactly 1 second. She looked at his daughter, then back to him, her face a study in professional neutrality. "Good morning, sir. How are we feeling today?" "Better. But I need you specifically for my assessment." His daughter's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd caught the formality, the way he'd asked for her by something other than what the ID badge said. "My daughter wanted to see how we're handling the chest tube." The Admiral lay propped at a 35-degree angle, his surgical dressing visible beneath the hospital gown. Natalie approached his right side, and her hands moved into position without conscious thought, fingers positioned for palpation, her stance wide enough to stabilize herself, weight distributed exactly as you would if you'd done this on a stretcher under fire while rounds were still downrange. She didn't think about it anymore. The body remembers. She checked the chest tube output, a pale straw-colored fluid that meant his lung was re-expanding cleanly. Her touch was efficient, her fingers reading the tissue around the insertion site with the delicate precision of a safecracker. The Admiral watched her hands with an intensity that made the back of her neck tighten. "That hand position," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room like a command. Combat medic style. Not civilian nursing school. Natalie's hand steadied the drainage chamber. "Standard protocol, sir." "Which unit?" The Admiral's eyes held hers. His daughter had gone very still, watching this exchange with the focus of someone who knew something significant was happening and couldn't quite name it. "I'm just a nurse," Natalie said. Her voice came out exactly as it always did, calm, measured, the voice of someone who had long ago learned that silence was a form of strength. She turned to adjust the fall line, using the motion to break eye contact. "Your vitals look solid. O2 sat at 97%. Pain management acceptable." "My father served 40 years, his daughter said sharply. She leaned forward in that chair, and Natalie recognized the tone instantly, a daughter who'd grown up around military people, who knew the shape of a military body when she saw one. "He knows what he's looking at." The Admiral's breathing stayed steady, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of a man trained to control every involuntary response. "Sanjin," he said. The word hung in the air like a photograph. "I saw your eyes when you positioned that needle. 2 nights ago. 0200 hours. That precision doesn't come from a textbook. You've done that under fire." Natalie's hand trembled. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second as she reached for the blood pressure cuff. She saw his daughter notice it, saw the Admiral's eyes track the involuntary movement with the satisfaction of recognition. She steadied the tremor with deliberate control, her breathing shifting into the deep cadence that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours and 2 years in classified locations she still wasn't allowed to name. "I need to check your vitals," she said. The words came out clipped, professional, final. She didn't wait for a response. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone leaving a room, and the Admiral let her go. He'd made his point. He'd looked into her eyes and seen something she'd spent 3 years burying, and now he knew. More importantly, now she knew that he knew. The hallway at Sacred Heart ran east-west like an arterial corridor, fluorescent panels casting everything in the color of institutional surrender. Natalie was halfway to the medication cart when she saw them, Sterling standing near the nurse's station with 2 figures beside him. One was Patricia Huang, the director of nursing. The other was a man in a navy blazer who wasn't hospital staff. Security didn't arrive until you knew you needed them. Sterling's face held the expression of a man who'd finally found the advantage he'd been hunting for. His smile was the kind a wolf makes when it circled something wounded. "Nurse Hayes. We need to speak to you. Privately." The morning shift was beginning its transition, and several nurses were within earshot. Natalie could feel their attention like pressure against her back. She moved toward Sterling's group, her posture unchanged, her expression a wall of professional composure. Whatever was coming, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing fear. "What's this regarding?" she asked. Her voice remained level, though something in her chest had already begun calculating exit strategies and legal precedent. Patricia Huang held a letter in her hands, the paper crisp and official, the kind of document that had been prepared in advance. Sterling gestured toward the break room. "In here." The break room at Sacred Heart smelled like old coffee and microwaved fish, a place where nurses went to decompress between crises, where conversations about impossible patients and impossible shifts died in whispers. Today it smelled like termination. Sterling closed the door with the careful deliberation of someone who wanted witnesses nearby but not so close they could hear specifics. "You performed an unauthorized needle decompression at 0200 hours this morning," Sterling said. His words came with the precision of a surgeon, each one placed deliberately. "On a patient without a direct physician order. That constitutes practicing beyond your scope of licensure." "The patient was in cardiac arrest," Natalie said. "Tension pneumothorax. The vital signs indicated." "I don't care what the vital signs indicated." Sterling's voice remained eerily calm. "You're a registered nurse. You follow protocols. You wait for physician orders. Instead, you performed an invasive procedure that's technically the domain of a trauma surgeon." Patricia Huang stepped forward, her expression caught between sympathy and institutional self-preservation. "An outside investigator has already been brought in to review your patient files. We've also contacted your nursing school and previous employers regarding credential verification. Until that investigation is complete, Sacred Heart has determined." She handed Natalie the letter. The paper felt heavier than it should, the weight of institutional machinery grinding forward. Natalie's eyes scanned the words, "Suspension effective immediately. Board review pending. Grounds for termination. Investigation into scope of practice violations. You're to turn over your credentials and your access badge," Sterling said. The man in the navy blazer, the investigator, presumably, had moved to stand near the door. Not blocking it. Not yet. Just positioned where Natalie would have to pass close to him to leave. "Security will escort you out and document the handover of hospital property." Natalie's hands remained still. She'd been trained to process information under duress, to categorize threats and prioritize responses when her life or others' lives hung in the balance. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was institutional power, the kind that wore a suit and carried a clipboard and had been carefully constructed over months of manipulation and phone calls and favors called in. She unclipped her ID badge from her scrubs. The laminate had worn smooth from 3 years of use. She reached for her stethoscope, the one with the custom earpieces she'd bought with her first hospital paycheck. She placed both items on the break room table, movements deliberate and slow, a ceremony of surrender. Her jacket hung on the back of the door, the scrubs jacket with the faded patch sewn carefully into the lining, the one piece of truth she'd carried through every shift. She pulled it off the hook and held it folded in her arms. The patch was so old the embroidery had faded to near invisibility, but she could feel it there beneath the fabric, the weight of it familiar as her own heartbeat. Unit colors. A call sign. Proof of a life that had been officially erased. "You'll be contacted regarding the investigation's findings," Patricia said. Her voice carried the professional distance of someone who had delivered this speech before and would deliver it many more times. "You're entitled to union representation if you wish to contest." Natalie didn't respond. She moved past the investigator and through the break room door. The day shift was in full operation now, the morning surge when the hospital became a machine of coordinated chaos. Nurses wheeled carts, physicians reviewed charts, patient families sat in waiting rooms reading magazines from 2019. Natalie walked through it all as if passing through a ghost story where she was the phantom. Nobody made eye contact. That was the worst part. Not Sterling's triumph or Patricia's institutional cowardice, but the silence of colleagues who had worked beside her for 3 years. Nurses she had covered for on their worst days, physicians she had corrected gently when their orders would have harmed a patient, techs she had defended when attending doctors grew impatient. The unit had learned Sterling's lesson well: stay silent, stay safe, stay employed. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and the lobby of Sacred Heart stretched before her like a foreign country. The morning sun coming through the windows felt hostile, too bright, too exposing. Security had walked her to the exit but didn't escort her further. That was the policy. Once you were off hospital property, you were someone else's problem. Natalie's car was parked in the southwest corner of the lot, a silver 2018 Civic that had never been driven during daylight hours in full awareness. The drive home should have taken 12 minutes. The drive home took 23, her hands on the wheel, her eyes on the road, her mind doing something it hadn't done in months, thinking about the before. The years when she'd been someone else, when her hands had done things that mattered in ways that couldn't be discussed, when her rank meant something and her skills had been recognized without question. The traffic lights of San Diego blurred past in sequence: red, yellow, green. Each color a countdown to something she didn't want to reach. The Admiral's monitor began its warning song at 0200 hours. A single sustained tone that cut through the quiet of the night shift like a blade. Natalie was 2 floors down, charting in the medication room, when the overhead crackled: code blue, room 347. Her hands were moving before her conscious mind caught up. The stairs, not the elevator. 30 seconds to the cardiac unit. Her badge clattered against the tile as she ran. Room 347 was chaos dressed in fluorescent light. The Admiral's oxygen saturation had dropped to 44%. His monitor showed the telltale signs: the peak pressure waveforms, the absence of breath sounds on the right side. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed, trapping air in his chest cavity, crushing his heart with every second that passed. The on-call resident stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something survivable. "Where's Sterling?" Natalie's voice cut through the alarm. "Unreachable. He's not answering his pager." She didn't waste time on disbelief. Sterling had a habit of turning his phone off during his evening chess games at the country club, 7 miles from the hospital. The Admiral had maybe 3 minutes before his blood pressure collapsed entirely. Her hands were already moving: gloves, alcohol swab, the surgical kit for emergency decompression. She felt the Admiral's ribs beneath her fingers, counting the spaces with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this with incoming fire and the sound of helicopters overhead. "Second intercostal space," she said, positioning the 14-gauge needle. "Midclavicular line." The resident stepped back. He understood, in that moment, what he was watching. This wasn't textbook procedure. This was muscle memory embedded in bone and reflex. This was someone who had done this when it mattered more than any credential ever could. The needle found the space between his ribs. One smooth motion. The hiss of air escaping, that sound that meant salvation. The monitor began its descent from the red zone. His oxygen saturation climbed, 51, 58, 67, 78, 84, finally settling at 91. The Admiral's eyes fluttered open, his body relaxing as oxygen returned to his starved tissues. His hand found Natalie's wrist, and he whispered something only she could hear, "Thank you, Senior Chief." She didn't react. Didn't question how he knew. Just steadied her breathing and checked his chest tube placement, her hand steady as surgical lasers, every movement economical and precise. By 0600 hours, Sterling arrived at the hospital. He parked in the chief of surgery spot and walked through the doors to find the Admiral stabilized, recovering, alive. And Natalie was still there, still in the room, documenting her care with the meticulous attention of someone who understood that paperwork was armor. Sterling's face changed when he learned what had happened at 0200. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched. She'd acted without authorization. She'd performed a procedure that required physician oversight. She'd stepped outside her scope and in doing so had violated the hierarchy that elevated him. She'd made it impossible to deny what she was capable of. By 0700, Sterling was in his office on the phone. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man deploying weapons he'd spent years preparing. The first call went to board member Harrison Blackwood, a retired insurance executive with influence over credentialing. "We have a nurse who's practicing beyond her scope. I'm building documentation." The second call went to board member Patricia Chen, who controlled the Quality Assurance Committee. "I'm concerned about medication administration errors and lack of proper physician communication." The third call went to Thomas Pierce, a hospital administrator Sterling had been cultivating for 3 years through expensive dinners and subtle favors. "We need to move quickly on this. Patient safety is at stake." Then Sterling made the calls that would matter most. He contacted Sacred Heart's nursing program, claiming he was conducting a routine background review, asking pointed questions about Natalie's graduation, her clinical performance, her stability. He implied, without quite stating, that he had concerns about her psychological fitness. His words were calculated to plant seeds of doubt that would take weeks to disprove. He brought in an outside investigator, a woman named Dr. Helen Voss, who specialized in healthcare compliance audits. Sterling gave her files that looked official, narratives that looked reasonable, a timeline that looked damning. A medication delay on March 15th, he docked at the timestamp. A vital sign not documented at 0400 on March 22nd, he'd simply removed it from the actual record. A note about patient concerns on April 3rd, Sterling wrote it himself, backdating it 3 weeks, signing it with Natalie's initials in a hand he'd practiced. Voss didn't question the documents. She was being paid $8,000 for a 3-day investigation, and Sterling's narrative was coherent, institutional, the product of someone who understood how to make fraud look like procedure. By 1400 hours, Sterling had what he needed. A paper trail. A case. A justification that would survive any cursory review. He called Natalie into his office and, with HR present, a woman named Sandra who owed Sterling her job, he read her suspension letter aloud. "You performed an emergency procedure without physician authorization and without proper credentials," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "Needle decompression is an advanced life support intervention. You exceeded your scope of practice. This constitutes a serious patient safety violation and grounds for immediate suspension pending a full investigation." Natalie stood in front of his desk. Her hands were steady. Her expression was neutral. She looked at Sterling and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The letter was already signed. The decision was already made. The machinery had already begun its work. "Security will escort you out," Sterling continued. "You're to have no contact with patients or staff. Turn in your badge and identification before you leave the building." The escort happened during shift change 0230 in the afternoon, when the day shift nurses were arriving and the night shift staff were leaving. Natalie walked through the corridors of Sacred Heart with 2 security guards flanking her, her badge already gone. She passed the break room where colleagues sat at the table. They looked away. They'd been warned, subtly, that association with her was unhealthy for career longevity. She passed the medication room where she'd charted 1,000 times. She passed room 347, where the Admiral was recovering, where the chest tube was still draining, where her work was still keeping him alive. No one spoke to her as she left. Her car was parked in the garage on level 2. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the hospital badge holder that was now empty. The early afternoon light filtered through the windshield, harsh and revealing. She started the engine and drove out into San Diego traffic, her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes forward, her mind somewhere between yesterday and tomorrow. The drive home took 18 minutes. She'd made this drive hundreds of times at 2,300 hours, always exhausted, always fulfilled, always returning to a life that existed in the margins. She'd never driven it in daylight while actively employed at Sacred Heart. The afternoon traffic was heavy, people leaving jobs, people heading to jobs, people going about the business of ordinary lives. She wasn't part of that anymore. She was suspended. Under investigation. Her career hung in the balance of documents she hadn't seen, accusations she hadn't been allowed to contest. She pulled into her driveway at 1,447 hours and sat in the car for a long moment, listening to it tick as it cooled. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. From the specific kind of restraint that comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of if you let yourself break. She got out, walked to her front door, and opened it to a house that was too quiet, too empty, too full of the life she'd been trying to protect. She walked to the kitchen and put her hands flat on the Formica counter, still in her scrubs, still carrying the smell of hospitals and antiseptic and the metallic scent of blood that had dried into her cuticles 2 hours ago. The suspension letter was probably in the mail already. Sterling had given it to her himself, signed in his careful handwriting, the signature of a man who believed he'd won. Natalie stood in her kitchen in the afternoon light and understood, with the kind of clarity that comes from having survived actual combat, that everything she'd built was collapsing. And worse than the suspension, worse than the investigation, was that she couldn't explain why to the person who would walk through that door in exactly 43 minutes, asking why Mommy was home so early, asking questions that demanded answers Natalie had promised never to give. The clock on her kitchen wall ticked forward. 1,448 hours. 14:49, the afternoon moved toward evening with the indifference of time that doesn't care about human suffering. What Natalie didn't know was that the Admiral had been awake the entire time, watching from room 347, recognizing not just the technique but the sacrifice. And what Dr. Sterling didn't know was that Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had spent the last 3 years existing in the margins precisely because she'd learned to operate in spaces where the rules didn't apply and the institutional machinery was designed to destroy people like her. Sterling had tried to use bureaucracy as a weapon against someone who'd survived actual warfare. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. And 43 minutes away, a military convoy was beginning its approach toward San Diego. The kitchen tile was cold under her bare feet. Natalie sat motionless at the table, still in her scrubs, the suspension letter folded twice in front of her. Dr. Sterling's signature sprawled across the bottom in aggressive blue ink, not a name, but a declaration. Practicing beyond scope of authority. Immediate suspension pending investigation. The words blurred and refocused as her vision wavered, but she didn't blink. She'd held steadier hands through worse than this. The clock above the refrigerator read 14:13. She'd been sitting here for 2 hours and 11 minutes, counting the seconds the way she'd learned to count in the dark, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, never looking past the next threshold. Her uniform was still damp where she'd stood under the parking lot rain after the security guard had walked her to her car. That hadn't been a request. It was a command. His hand on her elbow, gentle but firm, the way you'd guide someone away from a cliff. She didn't hear Emma come in. That was wrong. A good mother heard her daughter's footsteps, the backpack hitting the floor, the small shuffle of elementary school shoes against tile. Natalie should have heard it. Should have had time to wipe her face, fix her expression, become the version of herself that Emma knew, the one who had answers. Instead, Emma was suddenly standing in the kitchen doorway, her 7-year-old frame silhouetted against the hallway light, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her lunchbox in one hand. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emma's face changed. Children read pain like sonar, calibrated to detect the exact frequency of their mother's breaking. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma's voice was small. Confused. The kind of voice that held the entire weight of a world that made sense 5 seconds ago. Natalie opened her mouth. Closed it. The truth sat behind her teeth like something she'd swallowed and couldn't cough up. She'd been ordered to disappear. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had been erased from all records after the Sanjin operation went sideways, an extraction gone catastrophic, the kind of thing that lived in classified folders and Pentagon briefings, the kind of thing that got people killed if it surfaced. The Navy had given her a new name, a new life, instructions that were less suggestions and more commandments carved in steel. Never surface. Never use your real skills. Never let anyone know what you were before the uniform came off. Except now the Admiral knew. And Sterling knew something was wrong with his intuition, the way a shark tastes blood in the water. He didn't know what she was, but he'd recognized that she was something other than a night shift nurse, and he'd moved to eliminate her before she could become a problem. "Come here, baby," Natalie said. Her voice sounded like it was coming through water. "Sit with me." Emma dropped her backpack and climbed into the chair across from her mother, her legs too short to reach the floor. She was still wearing her school uniform, plaid jumper and white socks, her dark hair loose from its morning braids. She looked at the suspension letter, then at her mother's red-rimmed eyes, and something flickered across her face, a child's instinct that adult rules had just shifted, that the ground beneath her was different now. "Why are you sad?" Emma asked. "Mommy lost her job today," Natalie said carefully. "Not because she did anything wrong. Because there was a bad person who didn't want her working there anymore. Like Dr. Sterling." The shock of it, that Emma had heard enough to know the name, to understand the outline of betrayal, hit Natalie harder than she expected. Of course Emma knew. Kids absorbed these things through osmosis, through the tone of phone conversations, through the way their mother's shoulders held tension at the kitchen table. "Yes," Natalie said. "Like Dr. Sterling." Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Then, is he going to jail?" "I don't know," Natalie said, and it wasn't a lie. "But I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully because it's important and it's going to sound strange." Emma nodded, completely serious now, the way kids could shift into gravity when they sensed it was needed. "Before I was mommy, before I worked at the hospital, I had a different job. A very important job. For the Navy." Natalie paused, choosing words like she was diffusing something delicate. "I was a senior chief petty officer, which means I helped people who were hurt in very dangerous places." "Like a doctor?" Emma asked. "Like a doctor, but different. I was a medic. And I was good at it. Very good." Natalie's hands were still steady, but she could feel the tremor underneath, the way her own body wanted to break what her voice was keeping whole. "But something happened on one of my missions. Something that meant I had to stop being a senior chief and start being just mommy. The Navy said I couldn't tell anyone what I did, and I couldn't use my skills anymore, and I had to disappear." Emma's eyes were widening, the way a child's eyes looked when the world became larger, stranger, more dangerous than they'd thought. "Does that mean you're a secret agent?" Natalie almost laughed. The sound came out wrong, something between crying and choking. "Not quite, baby. But it means there are things about mommy that you didn't know." And now, she stopped. Breathed. Made a decision that felt like jumping without knowing if there was water below. "Now someone very important might know that I'm still here. And that's why I had to come home." Emma absorbed this with the solemnity of a child processing information that rewrote her understanding of her mother. "Is that why you helped that really sick man last night? The one mommy talked about? The Admiral?" Of course Emma would have heard something about him in the way children heard things, the reverberations of adult urgency, the way Natalie had come home that morning moving differently, carrying something heavy that wasn't physical. "Yes," Natalie said. "Because when someone is dying and I know how to save them, I save them. That's not a choice I can make. That's just who I am." Emma nodded slowly, accepting this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who was growing up faster than she should have to. She reached across the table and took her mother's hand, her small fingers wrapping around calluses that told their own story, the scars of work, the evidence of a life lived in ways Emma was only beginning to understand. The sun was setting outside the kitchen window, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, when Natalie heard the sound. Not sirens. Something deeper. The mechanical thrum of engines, multiple vehicles, heavy enough to feel in the floorboards. Emma's head snapped toward the window. "Mommy, what is that?" "Stay here," Natalie said, though she was already moving, already knowing. Her body knew before her mind caught up. The hiss of hydraulic brakes. The crunch of gravel in a driveway meant for one car, now holding 3. The specific cadence of military boots on pavement, not the measured pace of police, but the synchronized march of personnel conducting an operation. "Green trucks are outside." Emma was at the window, her voice high with excitement and confusion. "Mommy, there's green trucks and they're big, Ann." Natalie looked out and saw them. Not trucks. A military convoy. 3 Hums, Forest Service green, lined up on her suburban street like something from a different world, which it was. The neighbors across the street were already coming to their doors, confused, filming on their phones. This was the sound of the past breaking through the present, the sound of the Pentagon deciding that rules could be bent when a senior chief petty officer with the finest combat medicine skills in the Navy's arsenal needed to be acknowledged. The vehicle doors opened with synchronous precision. For sailors disembarked, enlisted personnel, young, professional, moving with the economy of motion that came from actual training. Behind them, a 5th figure emerged. Navy service dress blues, crisp as origami, captain's bars catching the sunset. He was maybe 55, with the bearing of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and slept fine afterward. His eyes found Natalie's house like a targeting system acquiring a lock. He walked to her door. Natalie stood paralyzed in her kitchen, Emma pressed against her leg, watching this man who carried the full weight of military authority in his posture approach their suburban home as if it were a compound under siege. The doorbell rang. Natalie moved to answer it. Emma came with her, still gripping her hand. When Natalie opened the door, the captain's eyes met hers and something shifted in his expression, confirmation, maybe, or the moment when official business became personal recognition. "Are you Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes?" he asked. The question landed like a defibrillator shock. 8 years. 8 years since anyone had called her by that name with official authority. 8 years of being Natalie, just Natalie, the night shift nurse, the quiet one, the one who stayed late and didn't complain. "Yes, sir," she said, and it wasn't a lie, but it was a surrender. The words felt like taking off a mask. "Your rank, please." She stood straighter without meaning to. Emma watched her mother's spine straighten, her shoulders settle, her entire bearing shift into something that wasn't quite military but wasn't civilian either, something that had been waiting 8 years to come back out. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, sir," Natalie said. The captain nodded, acknowledging the reclamation. Behind him, she could see the convoy, the neighbors, the evidence of her world breaking open. Emma squeezed her hand tighter, and Natalie felt her daughter's understanding reconfigure in real time. The woman holding her hand was still Mommy, but she was also something else, something that commanded respect through bearing alone. The captain handed her a file folder. His hands moved with deliberate ceremony, the way you handed something that mattered. "Your service record," he said. "Restored, effective immediately. Deployment records, commendations, and the Presidential Unit citation for Operation Sanjin. The record you were told never existed is now officially declassified." Natalie's hands trembled as she opened it. The evidence of her existence. The proof that what had happened was real, what she'd sacrificed had been recorded, what she'd been told to forget had never stopped being true. Deployment records. Commendation photos. Her own face in uniform, 8 years younger, standing with her unit in Sanjin province, the Hindu Kush mountains rising behind them like a wall between worlds. Then the SEAL team leader stepped forward. He was younger than the captain but older than her, late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came from living in places that aged you faster. His name tape read Graves, and his chest was a constellation of ribbons. Senior Chief Hayes earned 2 bronze stars, he said quietly. Emma's eyes widened. 2 bronze stars. Purple Heart, he continued. The captain shifted slightly, letting the next moment breathe. And a Navy Cross, Graves said, for pulling my men out of a kill zone at Sanjin when every tactical assessment said it was a suicide run. She's the finest combat medic the Navy ever buried. Welcome back, Senior Chief. He saluted. It was a gesture of respect that should have been impossible in a civilian home on a San Diego street, but SEAL Team 3 rendered it anyway, their hands moving to their brows, acknowledging a woman who'd saved their lives and then disappeared into a hospital night shift like she'd never carried a rifle or held a tourniquet under fire. Across the city, the fluorescent lights hummed in the Sacred Heart Physician's Lounge. Dr. Sterling was reviewing surgical schedules for the next week, his pen making notes in the margins, his mind already moving past the firing of the night shift nurse. She'd been a small problem. Erased. He didn't see the agents entering through the side door until they were standing on either side of his desk. Dr. Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest, the lead agent said, badge flashing like a weapon, for federal fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a classified military operation, and falsification of government-protected records. Sterling's coffee cup fell. It shattered on the linoleum floor, white ceramic scattering like bone, dark liquid spreading across the light tile like blood. His mouth opened and closed without sound, his face draining of color as the agents moved with rehearsed efficiency, handcuffs clicking closed around wrists that had signed so many authoritative signatures. The nursing director watched from the doorway. She'd worked with Sterling for 12 years. She watched them read him his rights and lead him toward the elevator, his white coat bright against their dark suits, his face turned away from the staff who were now emerging from their stations, watching the scene with the stunned expression of people whose institutional hierarchy had just collapsed. They walked him through the ICU. Past the nurses' station where 2 nurses turned in unison to watch him pass. Past room 347, where the Admiral sat propped on pillows, recovering from wounds that should have killed him, his eyes following Sterling's procession with the expression of someone watching justice move at its own terrible speed. Cameras were waiting outside. Someone had tipped the local news, an anonymous Pentagon source who had a vested interest in making sure the world knew what Dr. Marcus Sterling had tried to do. The photographers caught everything. His hands cuffed behind his back. His head down. His white coat, the symbol of his authority, the marker of his status, reduced to an accessory on a man being led to a federal vehicle. By noon, the footage was playing on every San Diego news station. Dr. Sterling's perp walk, the Chiron read, and below it, Chief of Surgery arrested in federal fraud investigation. The hospital board convened an emergency session that afternoon. Sterling's father, Board President Sterling, sat at the table as lawyers explained the details. His son had attempted to terminate a federally protected military operative. He had forged government documents. He had compromised what might have been classified operations. His actions were criminal, not merely unethical. The board voted unanimously within an hour. Medical privileges revoked. License referral to the state board. Full cooperation with federal investigators. Within a week, the state medical board released its decision. Not a suspension. A revocation. Sterling's name went into the National Practitioner Data Bank, a permanent public record that made him unemployable in any clinical setting in the United States. His medical career was over, not suspended, but permanently ended, struck from the record like he'd never been a doctor at all. His wife filed for divorce. She took the house in La Jolla and the 401k and the country club membership. His father resigned from the hospital board, his name tainted by association, his legacy compromised by a son who'd thought his privilege would protect him from consequences. 3 months later, someone spotted Sterling at a strip mall off Route 805. He was sitting at a folding table with a banner made of vinyl, affordable auto insurance, all credit welcome. He was wearing a polo shirt with a company logo, not a white coat. His hair was longer, unkempt. He was making phone calls, reading from a script, his voice hollow in the way voices became when the world had already defeated you. A former Sacred Heart nurse walked past. She recognized him. She didn't stop. At Sacred Heart Hospital, Natalie Hayes stood in the emergency department in her navy dress blues, 6 months after the convoy had appeared on her street. The uniform was tailored perfectly, the ribbons arranged in ascending order of prestige, the bronze stars first, the purple heart next, and pinned moments ago to her chest, the Navy Cross, which sat above her heart like a weight and a wings both. Emma was in the front row of chairs, wearing her best dress, her eyes never leaving her mother. Beside her sat Commander Graves, the SEAL team leader, in his own dress blues. Around them, the entire emergency medicine department had gathered for the ceremony. Doctors who'd worked with Natalie. Nurses who'd watched her absorb Sterling's cruelty in silence. Residents who'd had no idea that the quiet night shift nurse had been one of the Navy's most decorated combat medics. The Admiral was there too, his color better now, his wounds healed to the point where he could stand without visible pain. He approached the podium and opened a folder. "Today we restore what should never have been hidden," he began, his voice steady and official. The service record of Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. A woman who gave everything for her country and asked for nothing in return. He read the citations. Each one detailed operations Natalie had tried to forget, the Sanjin compound, the extraction gone wrong, the men she'd pulled from a burning building under fire, the surgeries performed with rounds screaming past her position, the decisions that had cost her own blood to make. For extraordinary heroism and exceptional courage under direct enemy fire, for performing emergency medical operations under conditions that would have prevented most personnel from functioning, for the extraction and rescue of 15 American personnel from a position overrun by hostile forces, the United States Navy awards the Navy Cross to Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. He moved forward with the medal. His hands were steady as he pinned it to her chest, and she stood without flinching, without trembling, without the slightest indication that she was anything other than a military officer receiving an official honor. "Your country hasn't forgotten, Senior Chief," the Admiral said quietly, just for her ears. "Welcome home." Natalie saluted. Perfect form. No emotion. After the ceremony, she was offered a position. Director of Emergency Medicine Training at Sacred Heart Hospital, appointed by the hospital CEO with a formal apology for what had occurred. She would teach the next generation of nurses and residents combat-level trauma response, the skills that saved lives not just on battlefields but in emergency departments everywhere. The needle decompression technique that had saved the Admiral's life. The triage assessment under pressure. The decision-making when seconds meant the difference between living and dying. The unit board where Sterling had posted the fabricated write-up now displayed her commendations. A reminder. A testament. In her office, she kept the faded unit patch from Sanjin in a frame on her desk, the one she'd carried sewn into her jacket lining for 8 years, the one piece of truth she'd never been able to hide, only conceal. Beside it, a photo of Emma pinning her chief's anchors at the ceremony, her small hands trembling with pride and the weight of understanding that her mother was something far larger than she'd known. Across town, Sterling sat at his folding table as rain began to fall. His banner sagged, the vinyl dimpling with water. His phone stayed silent. A driver passed, recognized him, laughed from his car window. Sterling didn't look up. At Sacred Heart, Natalie ended her shift, walking through the same hallways where she'd been escorted out 8 years into her lie. But this time, nurses nodded respect. Residents asked questions. She taught them what she'd told Emma that night when the world rewrote itself on a suburban street: true class is what you do when the lights go out. This is the kind of story that reminds us, the quietest person in the room might be the strongest. If you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength becoming undeniable. Drop a comment, What would you do if the Pentagon showed up at your door with proof that your entire life was a lie? I'm reading them all.